Good evening, and welcome back to Half Past History. This is the channel where history is told slowly, slow enough to rest to, slow enough, if you like, to fall asleep to. Tonight we are going to sit up through the night with someone you have almost certainly never thought about in a small lamplit room beside a railway line, listening to a sound that once tied a whole continent together. A quiet, steady clicking sound. The sound of the wire. But before we begin, let us get you comfortable. Set your screen aside or turn its light down low. You will not need your eyes tonight. Let the pillow take the full weight of your head. If there is a fan turning somewhere or rain against the glass, let those sounds settle in beneath my voice. They belong here. And so does the small clicking you will hear about tonight, which was, for the people who lived by it, one of the most companionable sounds in the world. There is nothing you need to hold on to tonight. Nothing to remember, nothing to solve. If you drift off somewhere in the middle, that is not a failure. That is the whole idea. The wire will keep clicking without you the way it always did all through the night, carrying its messages over the dark and sleeping country, whether anyone was awake to hear or not. Take one slow breath in and let it go. Good. Let us begin. Here is a picture that probably comes to mind when you think of a telegraph operator, if you think of one at all. You imagine someone dull. A clerk in a green eyeshade tapping mechanically at a little brass key, sending someone else's words down a wire. A cog, a human part of a machine doing something repetitive and gray and faintly boring in the days before the world got interesting. Set that picture aside because it is almost exactly wrong. For the better part of a century, from the 1840s until the world of the automobile and the telephone, the telegraph was not a boring machine. It was the most astonishing thing that had ever happened to human communication, and the people who worked it were not cogs. They were the operators of what one modern writer beautifully called the Victorian Internet. They sat at the very center of a nervous system that had suddenly, for the first time in all of history, allowed a thought to travel faster than a horse could run, faster than a ship could sail, faster than anything, across a whole continent in the time it takes to tap it out. And here is the thing that the gray picture hides. On the other end of that wire were people. Thousands of them, sitting in thousands of little offices. And because the slow hours of the night were long and the wire was always there, they talked to each other. They joked. They gossiped up and down the line. They played pranks. They fell in and out of friendships and, more than once, into love with people they had never seen and might never meet, whose whole personality they knew only through the rhythm of their tapping. They developed their own slang, their own etiquette, their own celebrities, the lightning-fast operators whose skill was talked about 1,000 miles away. It was, in other words, a living human world, a warm, chattering, romantic, competitive, deeply human community strung out on wires across the dark of a young country and held together by a skill so strange and beautiful that most people today do not even know it was possible. Because these operators did not read their messages off a printed tape. After a while, the best of them threw the tape away and simply listened and heard in a stream of clicks faster than speech, not dots and dashes at all, but words, whole sentences. The voice of a friend 1,000 miles off, arriving as sound in a quiet room. That is the world we are going to visit tonight. Not the gray clerk at the boring machine. The real one. The lamplit operator alone in the small hours reading the living voice of a distant stranger out of the clicking of a little brass instrument in the golden age of the wire. Here is the road ahead of us tonight. We will begin with the wire itself and the almost unbelievable moment it first spoke. Then we will look closely at the instrument, the key and the clicking sounder, and learn the strange deep skill of hearing words in sound. We will sit with a new operator learning the language and then settle into the long quiet of the night office, which is the most restful place in this whole story. We will meet the railroad telegrapher holding the lives of whole trains in the messages he tapped. We will meet the women of the wire, for whom this was one of the first skilled and respected jobs a woman could hold. We will hear about romance by wire and the love stories that bloomed between people who had never met. We will follow the drifting tramp operators from town to town and meet two boys who started at the key and became, one of them the greatest inventor and the other very nearly the richest man in America. We will watch a single wire crawl across the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. And then gently we will hear the clicking begin to fade as a new age came in, until at last the wire fell silent. And near the end, if you are still awake, there are two quiet gifts waiting. One is the day the very last telegram was sent, which was not nearly as long ago as you might think. The other is the surprising truth that the code itself never really died at all. If these slow journeys into the past bring you any peace, a like helps other tired minds find this quiet harbor, and subscribing means you will never miss an evening. And if you feel like it, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are tonight and what hour it is where you are. I read every one, and it is a comfort to know how many of us are drifting off together out along the line. But there is no hurry about any of that. There was hurry on the wire by day. By night, there was all the time in the world. So settle deeper into your pillow now. It is sometime in the 1870s. The town outside is asleep, and in a small room above the railway platform a lamp is burning and a little brass instrument is beginning softly to speak. Let us go and listen. To feel what the telegraph was, you have to first feel the silence it broke. For all of human history, up to a certain spring day in 1844, a message could travel no faster than the fastest thing that carried it. A word from one city to another went at the speed of a galloping horse or a sailing ship or a running man, and no faster ever for thousands of years. If something happened in one place, the people in the next place found out when someone arrived to tell them days or weeks later. A battle could be won or lost, a president elected, a loved one taken ill and buried, and the news would still be crawling across the country long after the event was over. Distance and time were the same thing. To be far away was to be in the past. And then a man named Samuel Morse, working with a partner named Alfred Vail, strung a wire between the city of Washington and the city of Baltimore, some 40 miles off. And on the 24th of May, 1844, he sat down to send the first official message along it. The words were chosen by a young woman named Annie Ellsworth, the daughter of a friend, and they were a line from the Bible, 4 words, grave and astonished. What hath God wrought? What has God made? Morse tapped it out in the Capitol. And 40 miles away in a railroad station in Baltimore, in the very same instant, Alfred Vail's instrument spelled it back. Not an hour later, not a day later. In the same breath, for the first time since the beginning of the world, a thought had traveled from one place to another faster than a body could carry it. It is hard for us to feel how enormous that was, because we swim in it now. But try as you lie there. Everything you know about instant messages, about news that arrives the moment it happens, about a world where far away no longer means later, all of it begins in that one small clicking sound in a Baltimore railroad station. What hath God wrought indeed? And it spread with astonishing speed. Within a few years, wires were marching out across the country on their poles alongside the new railroad tracks, stitching town to town and city to city. There's one moment in that spreading that is worth pausing on, because it is such a perfect little parable of how fast the new world swept the old one away. In these years, there was another marvel of speedy communication that Americans were proud of, the Pony Express, the relay of brave young riders on fast horses who carried the mail across the empty West, changing mounts at lonely stations, galloping day and night to get a letter from one side of the country to the other in a heroic 10 days. It was the stuff of legend even at the time. And in the autumn of 1861, the telegraph wire, creeping west from the east and east from the west, finally met itself in the middle and joined into one unbroken line clear across the continent. The transcontinental telegraph was complete. A message could now cross the whole country not in 10 days, but in the space of a breath. And the Pony Express, that gallant, romantic, thundering thing, was rendered pointless overnight. It closed its doors just 2 days after the wire was joined. 2 days. The horses had not even been unsaddled before the wire made them history. That is how fast this was moving. The fastest, bravest thing anyone could imagine, undone in an afternoon by a quiet clicking on a wire. And it did not stop at the coasts. In time, the wires reached across oceans too, until a message could run from one side of the country to the other in minutes, and a great humming web of copper and iron lay over the whole of the civilized world. People called it, with a kind of awe, the great nervous system of the nation. And every nerve in that system, every point where the wire touched the human world and a message was sent or received, was a person, an operator sitting at a key. And it changed utterly the thing we call the news. Before the wire, a newspaper was a local and a slow thing, full of events already days or weeks old, of happenings in far cities that had ambled in by mail and stagecoach. After the wire, the news became something new under the sun. It became instant. A speech given in Washington in the afternoon could be read at a breakfast table 1,000 miles away the next morning, still warm. The newspapers, hungry for this miraculous fresh news, but staggered by the cost of sending long messages down the expensive wire, banded together to share the load, forming great cooperative news services to gather reports by telegraph and split the bill. And the modern news industry, the thing that still floods your phone tonight with events from the far side of the planet minutes after they happen, was born there, on the wire, out of that hunger for the fresh and the fast. The very way a news story is written, the most important fact crammed into the very first line in case the wire failed before the rest got through, is a habit learned at the telegraph key and never unlearned. When you read a headline tonight, you are reading in a shape the telegraph operators taught us. But behind every one of those miracles, remember, sat a person, an operator at a key. So let us look closely and quietly at what sat on the operator's desk, because the whole of tonight lives inside these few small objects. There was the key, a simple, beautiful thing, a little lever of brass on a heavy base with a knob on the end where the fingers rested. Press it down, and it closed a circuit and sent a pulse of electricity racing down the wire. A short press made a short pulse, which everyone came to call a dot. A slightly longer press made a longer pulse, a dash. That was all. Every message that ever crossed the wire, every declaration of war and every birthday greeting and every stock price and every I love you was made of nothing but these two things, the dot and the dash, in patterns tapped out on a little brass lever by a human hand. And there was the thing that received. In the very earliest days, the machine tried to print the dots and dashes as marks on a moving paper tape so the operator could read them off with his eyes. But something wonderful happened almost at once that no one had quite planned. The machine that pressed the marks onto the tape made a sound as it worked, a click as the arm came down, a slightly different click as it lifted. And the operators discovered to their own surprise that they could hear the message in those clicks faster and more surely than they could read it off the tape. So they stopped looking at the tape altogether. To make the sound clearer, they built a device just for listening. It was called a sounder. A small electromagnet that clicked sharply once when the current came on and once when it went off, so that a dot became a quick click, click, close together, and a dash became a click, a pause, and a click. And because a lonely little sounder is quiet, they set it inside an open wooden box tilted toward the operator called a resonator, which gathered the sound and threw it toward the ear, the way the body of a violin gathers the sound of the strings. Every telegraph office in the world came to have this same small altar on the desk. The key for speaking. The sounder in its wooden resonator for listening. A lamp. And a chair for the long hours. That is the whole of it. That clicking wooden box, throwing its sharp little sounds into a quiet room, is the instrument that carried the news of a century. And it made all day and all night a sound that the people who worked beside it came to love the way you love the ticking of a clock in a childhood house, a sound so constant and so companionable that they said the silence, when the wire finally went dead, was the loneliest thing they ever heard. Listen for it as we go on. That soft, patient clicking in the lamplight in the small hours. It is the heartbeat of everything tonight. Now to sit at that key and read that sounder was not a small skill. It was in fact one of the strangest and most demanding skills of the whole 19th century, and learning it changed the shape of a person's mind. It began, usually, young. A boy or a girl of 13 or 14 would come into an office as a messenger, running the finished telegrams from the office out to the homes and shops of the town, and in the slow moments they would hang about the operators, watching, listening, aching to learn. And in a corner there was often a practice set, a key and a sounder wired to nothing but each other, where an apprentice could tap away and drill the code into their fingers and their ears without troubling the real wire. And what they were learning was a language. Every letter of the alphabet had its own little pattern of dots and dashes. The letter that we call E, the most common letter, was given the shortest possible signal, a single dot, one quick click, so that common things would be fast to send. Rarer letters got longer patterns. A skilled sender could rattle out these patterns as fast as you could speak, the hand almost a blur on the key. But sending was the easy half. The hard and beautiful half was receiving. Because at first the beginner hears only clicks, a meaningless stutter of sound, and must painfully translate each little pattern back into its letter, and then hold the letters in mind until they make a word. It is slow and exhausting, and the messages come faster than the mind can follow, and many gave up. And then, for those who stayed, something remarkable happened. The same thing that happens when you learn to read or to understand a spoken language. One day, without quite noticing when the operator stopped hearing dots and dashes, the translating step simply vanished. They heard directly out of the clicking words. Whole words arriving in the ear as plainly as if someone had spoken them. The very best operators reached a point where they no longer seemed to be working at all. They could receive a fast message and copy it down in a clean hand while carrying on a spoken conversation with the person beside them about something else entirely, their pen filling with one stream of language while their mouth ran with another. To the people who could not do it, it looked very nearly like magic. It was simply what happens when a language sinks all the way down, below thought, into the bone, and every operator had a voice. Because a hand on a key has a rhythm, a lilt, a set of little habits, just as a speaking voice does, the operators up and down a line could tell one another apart without any name being given, purely by the feel of the sending. They called it the fist. A good operator had a clean, clear, graceful fist, a pleasure to receive. A tired or careless one had a heavy or ragged fist that the others grumbled about. You knew your friends on the wire by their fist the way you know a friend by their footstep on the stair. And that, more than anything, is what turned a web of wires into a community of people. Every message came in someone's own hand. So now let us go into the office itself at the hour this channel loves best, the middle of the night. By day, a telegraph office was a busy place. In a Western Union office in a town of any size, the messages came thick and fast, business and news and family word, and the counter was crowded, and several operators worked their keys at once in a clatter of overlapping sound. By day it was work and hurry and noise, and darting through all of it were the messenger boys. Every office had its little flock of them boys of 12 and 14 in uniform caps, who took the finished telegram, the flimsy slip of paper with its pasted strips of words, and ran it on foot or on a bicycle through the streets to the house or the shop or the office it was addressed to. It was a humble job, the very bottom rung, a few dollars a week and a great deal of running. But it put a boy right at the doorstep of the wire, and a sharp one could not help but soak it up, loitering by the keys between errands, catching the code by ear, dreaming of the day he might sit in the operator's chair himself. We will meet, before the night is out, two particular messenger boys who did exactly that and climbed from that bottom rung to the very top of the age. But even the ones who did not become famous learned something at that counter, standing in the current of the whole world's news as it flowed in and out of their little town. To be a telegraph messenger was to be, briefly, the fastest moving part of the fastest thing in the world. But that was the day. Our night is quieter. But the wire never slept, and so neither entirely did the office. And in the small hours, in a country station or a quiet branch office, the whole busy world would narrow down to a single lamplit room and a single operator, awake and alone, keeping the watch. Picture it, because it is worth resting inside. The town outside is dark and still, every window black, every one you can think of asleep. Inside, one lamp burns low on the desk. A small stove ticks in the corner, keeping off the chill. And on the desk, in its wooden resonator, the sounder clicks, now and then, in the quiet. Long stretches of silence, and then a little run of clicks as some message passes down the line, perhaps not even meant for this office, just traffic flowing through the night from some far city to some other, and the operator half listening, the way you half hear a train in the distance. It was, by every account we have, a deeply peaceful way to pass a night, once you were used to the solitude. The operator was alone, but not lonely, because the wire was company. Down that clicking line were other night operators in other lamplit rooms 100 miles off, 500 miles off, all of them awake in the same darkness, all of them keeping the same watch. And in the long, empty hours, they would talk. One would tap out a greeting to another down the line, and they would chat in that private clicking language about nothing at all, about the weather, about the slow night, about a book, about a girl, the way night workers everywhere keep each other company through the long hours before dawn. A whole invisible society of the wakeful scattered across the sleeping land, holding quiet conversation in code while the rest of the world dreamed. There was one more thing that filled those quiet hours, and it is the detail that makes people smile with recognition, because it is so exactly like our own connected world. On the wire, there were secrets. There had to be. If a message could be read by every operator whose office shared the line, then anything private, a business deal, a lover's word, a bank's instruction to send a fortune, could be read by strangers as easily as by the person it was meant for. And so people wrapped their words in codes. Whole thick books of commercial code were printed and sold in which a single innocent word stood for a long and secret sentence, so that a merchant could send his rival-proof instructions cheaply and safely, and the operator tapping them out had no idea what he was really saying. Governments and armies use ciphers no enemy could crack. And where there are secrets and money moving invisibly at the speed of light, there are, of course, schemes, and the wire had its swindlers and its tricksters too, its clever thieves who found ways to game the racing results or the market prices in the minutes before the news went public. It is worth sitting with how familiar all of this is. A global network carrying the world's news and money and love at the speed of light. A private language known only to its skilled initiates. Codes and encryption to keep out prying eyes. Romances and friendships between people who had never met. Pranks, gossip, celebrities, scammers, and a great deal of ordinary human chatter filling up the quiet hours. It was truly the Internet, a full lifetime and more before anyone dreamed of a computer built out of copper wire and iron and the trained ears of a few clever operators. And tonight we are visiting it at its most peaceful hour. You could do worse on a night when sleep is slow to come than to imagine yourself there. The low lamp, the warm stove, the dark window, and the patient, companionable clicking of the wire carrying the soft talk of unseen friends across the whole breadth of the sleeping country, asking nothing of you at all. Now, not every operator sat in a town office sending birthday wishes. There was another kind of telegrapher, and his work carried a weight that would make your hands sweat, and he sat where the wire and the railroad met. Remember that the telegraph and the railroad grew up together, side by side, the wires marching along the tracks on their poles the whole length of the line. That was no accident. The railroad needed the telegraph, needed it desperately because of a simple and terrifying problem. On a single track of rail, a train going east and a train going west are on a collision course, and neither one can see very far ahead, and neither one can stop quickly, and there are no traffic lights in the wilderness. So how do you keep them from meeting? The answer was the telegraph and the man who worked it. At small stations all along the line sat the depot operator, and through his little office passed the orders that governed the movement of every train. A dispatcher far away, watching the whole line in his mind, would tap out an order. Hold the westbound train at your station until the eastbound has passed. And the depot operator would receive that order out of the clicking and copy it down and hand it up to the driver of the waiting train, often on a long forked stick or a hoop held up beside the moving cars so the crew could snatch it without stopping. And everything depended on him getting it right. A single letter misheard, a station name confused, a number dropped, an order handed to the wrong train, and two locomotives full of sleeping passengers would come together in the dark at a closing speed no one could survive. The depot operator, often a young man or woman alone at a country station in the middle of the night, held the lives of hundreds of strangers in the accuracy of their ear and the steadiness of their hand. It was one of the great unseen responsibilities of the age, carried out over and over through every night by ordinary people at small keys in small rooms, and carried out overwhelmingly correctly, which is its own quiet miracle. And the depot operator was more than a keeper of the trains. In 1,000 small towns, he or she was the town's one thread to the whole wide world. The depot was where the wire came, and so the depot was where the news came, all of it, before it reached anyone else. The result of a distant election, the outcome of a far-off battle, the market price of the grain the whole town lived on, the birth and the death and the wedding in a family 2 states away, all of it arrived first in the clicking of the depot sounder and passed first through the ears of the operator. In a very real way, the operator knew the news of the world before the mayor did, before the newspaper did, before anyone. People would gather on the platform on the evening of an election, waiting while the operator sat at the key with the whole country pouring through, and then came out and told them who had won. To be the operator was to be the place where your little town touched the century. That small town depot, with its bay window looking both ways down the track, its clattering sounder, its order hoops hung by the door, and its lone operator keeping the trains apart through the dark and holding the whole town's window on the world, is one of the most purely American images there is. Half the little towns in the country grew up around one, and the person inside it, we should remember, was as likely as not to be a woman. If you want to feel the full weight the wire could carry, consider that it was the tool by which a president fought a war. When the Civil War came, the telegraph became overnight the nervous system of the whole vast conflict. Generals in the field could be commanded and could report in something close to real time across hundreds of miles, and a whole military telegraph corps of young operators went to war carrying their keys, tapping out the movements of armies from tents in courthouses and captured farmhouses, often under fire, in secret ciphers that the enemy could not read. For the first time in history, a war could be directed from the capital as it happened, and the man who did the directing was Abraham Lincoln. And here's the picture I would like to leave with you, because it is one of the quietly astonishing scenes of American history. Lincoln did not have a telegraph in the White House, so through the long nights of the war, whenever a great battle was being fought and the fate of the country hung on the news, the tall, tired president would put on his hat and walk out of the White House and across the lawn to the War Department next door, and go up to the telegraph office and sit down at the desk of the chief operator, a man named Thomas Eckert, and wait. Hour after hour through the night he would sit among the young operators, reading each dispatch the moment it was copied out of the clicking, living the battle a word at a time, the whole crushing weight of the war coming to him through that little brass sounder. The operators grew used to him there, the melancholy giant at their elbow, and he grew fond of them, and found, he said, a strange comfort in their company and their quiet work through the dark. And it was there, in that telegraph office, in the summer, waiting for news, at the operator's own desk, that Abraham Lincoln took up a pen between dispatches and began to write the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. The document that freed the enslaved millions of the South was begun in a room full of clicking sounders by a man who had walked over in the night to be near the wire. That is what the telegraph was, not a boring machine. The place where a nation's news and a nation's fate arrived, one click at a time, into the ear of whoever was keeping the watch. Which brings us to something genuinely remarkable and easy to miss about the whole world of the wire. It was, for its time, extraordinarily open to women, and it was the very war we have just spoken of that threw the doors open. Think about the age we are in. This is a century in which almost every skilled, respected, well-paid kind of work was closed to women by custom and often by law. A woman could teach small children, or sew, or serve, and very little else that the world called a proper trade. The doors were shut, nearly all of them. But the telegraph key did not know or care who was pressing it. The wire carried a clean message, whether the fist that sent it belonged to a man or a woman, and a message received correctly was received correctly regardless of who sat in the chair. The skill was the skill. And so telegraphy became one of the very first skilled, respected, decently paid occupations in which a woman could stand fully equal to a man and be hired in principle into any office or any depot in the country on the strength of nothing but how well she worked the wire. The great opening came with the Civil War, when so many men went off to fight that the offices needed operators wherever they could find them, and women stepped up to the keys in large numbers and proved to anyone who had doubted it that they were every bit as fast and as accurate and as steady under pressure as the men they replaced. Before the war, only a small fraction of operators were women. By the end of it, in many places, they were half or more. And they did not leave when the war ended. They stayed at the keys in the offices and the depots, earning their own wages, living independent lives, respected up and down the line for a clean fist and a cool head, in a world that gave women almost no other way to be any of those things. The old operators told a gentle joke that you could always tell a woman on the wire because her sending had a certain lightness and grace to it, a delicacy in the fist. Whether that was really true or just something men like to believe, it points at something real. On the wire, a woman had a voice and a reputation and a place earned entirely on her own merits in an age that offered her almost nowhere else to earn them. For a great many women, the little brass key was the most independent thing in their lives. Now put together the two things we have just seen. A wire full of long, quiet, wakeful hours. And at the keys up and down that wire, men and women, young, clever, quick, spending those hours in each other's company in a private, clicking language that no one around them could understand. You can guess what happened. Of course you can. People fell in love over the telegraph. It was common enough that it got its own name. Romance by wire. Two operators, perhaps hundreds of miles apart, perhaps never having laid eyes on one another, would find themselves working the same line, and in the slow hours they would begin to talk, and the talk would become a friendship, and the friendship would become something warmer, all of it carried in dots and dashes, all of it in that intimate rhythm of the fist that let you know a person without a face or a voice. They knew each other's moods by the wire. They could tell when the other was tired or teasing or sad by nothing but the feel of the sending. They courted in code night after night across the dark of the country. And here is a detail that people at the time found scandalous and delicious in equal measure. The lines were not private. Many offices shared a single wire, so that an operator could hear the traffic of a dozen or 20 other offices flowing past, which meant that when two lovers courted over the line, the whole line could listen in. And they did. A budding wire romance became a kind of nightly entertainment for every other operator on the circuit who followed it and teased about it and took sides, the way a whole office today might follow an office romance, except that here the office was 500 miles long. We even have a novel about it written from the inside. In 1879, a telegraph operator named Ella Cheever Thayer, who worked the wire at a Boston hotel, published a book called Wired Love, a romance of dots and dashes about two operators who fall in love over the line before they ever meet. It was a great popular success, read and loved for years. And the most astonishing thing in it is a small moment where a character dreaming imagines a device you could carry with you and hold to your ear so that when you were far from the one you loved, you could hear their beloved voice across any distance. She was describing, in a love story decades early, the telephone in your pocket. She had felt, sitting at her key in a Boston hotel, exactly where all of this was heading. Love, it turns out, is a very good telescope. And there was at least one couple who took it all the way and were married over the wire itself. The ceremony tapped out in code from one town to another, the bride and groom perhaps not even in the same room, their vows crossing the country as dots and dashes and arriving, one imagines, to a great clattering cheer from every eavesdropping operator on the line. A magazine of the day even ran a solemn warning about the dangers of what it called wired love, which tells you, more than anything, how real and how common it had become. People had found in this cold machinery of copper and iron a brand new way to do the oldest and warmest human thing of all. There was one more kind of operator we have to meet, because he is the most romantic figure in the whole story, and because two of the most famous men in American history began their lives as exactly this. The tramp telegrapher. Here is the thing about a skill that is the same everywhere. If you could work a wire, you could work it anywhere. Every town of any size in the whole country had an office, and every office sometimes needed a hand, and the skill you carried in your ears and your fingers was your passport to all of them. And so there grew up a whole restless tribe of young operators who simply drifted. They would work in office for a few weeks or a few months, grow bored or restless, draw their pay, and move on, riding the very railroads whose orders they had been tapping from town to town to town, working a while wherever they landed, seeing the country, answering to no one. They had a reputation, the tramp operators, as clever, cocky, unreliable, brilliant young people forever moving on. They knew each other loosely all across the land, this scattered brotherhood and sisterhood of the wire, recognizing a fellow drifter by a shared slang and a shared restlessness. They had a whole culture of their own, in fact, invisible to everyone else. They had nicknames and signatures they tapped at the end of their messages, so that a familiar fist coming down a strange line might turn out to be an old friend from 3 towns and 2 years ago. They had a shorthand of abbreviations for the common things, worn smooth by a million sendings, little scraps of code within the code that only operators knew. They gossiped along the wire about which offices were good berths and which superintendents were tyrants and where a good hand might find work next. They played jokes on the greenhorns and told tall tales in the dead hours and mourned their own when one of them died. It was, in every way that matters, a trade with a soul, a real community of skilled and wandering people who happened never to be gathered in one room, but who lived all of them together inside the same clicking wire. And when one of them settled down at last, or grew too old to wander, or when the work itself began to fade, what they missed was not the pay or even the travel. It was the company on the line, the voices in the dark. To a boy stuck in a small town, the life of the tramp telegrapher looked like the freest thing imaginable. You had a skill the whole world wanted, it weighed nothing and lived in your own head, and it would carry you anywhere there was a wire, which by now was everywhere. For a certain kind of quick, curious, impatient young person, there had never been a better ticket to the wide world. And one such quick, curious, impatient young person, drifting the wires of the Midwest in the 1860s, tapping out train orders by night and tinkering with the instruments by day, was a half-deaf teenager named Thomas Alva Edison. But he deserves a chapter of his own. Let us give him one. Thomas Edison came to the wire the way a great many boys did, by way of an accident and a kindness. He was a poor, restless, half-deaf boy of 15, already working the train selling newspapers and candy, when he happened to be standing on a station platform and saw a small child, the young son of the station master, toddle out onto the tracks directly in the path of a rolling freight car. Edison dropped what he was holding and dashed out and snatched the child up and out of the way just in time. And the boy's father, the station master, who was himself a telegraph operator and had nothing else with which to reward the young man who had saved his son, offered to teach him the wire. It was the making of him. Edison took to telegraphy with a ferocious, obsessive energy, and for the next several years he lived exactly the life of the tramp operator, drifting from town to town across the middle of the country, working the night shift wherever he could get it, in Fort Wayne, in Indianapolis, in Cincinnati, in Nashville, in Louisville. And it was here at the key in the long, boring hours of the night watch that the inventor in him was born. There is a story, told so often it has become legend, of a night job where the operator was required to send a signal down the wire once every hour, all night, simply to prove to a distant supervisor that he was awake at his post. Young Edison, who had better things to do with the night than stay awake proving he was awake, rigged up a little clockwork device that would send the hourly signal automatically and then went comfortably to sleep. He was, you understand, inventing labor-saving machinery before he was out of his teens in order to be lazier. Every great inventor should start exactly there. His telegraph years did not all go smoothly. There is a night on a railway in Canada when a message he failed to act on in time nearly brought two trains together, and he lost that post in a hurry. But the wire had done its work on him. Because here's the thing that so few people know about Thomas Edison. Before he was the wizard of the electric light, before the phonograph and the moving picture, he was first and for years a telegraph man, and it was the telegraph that made him. His mind, sitting at those keys through all those long nights, had begun to itch at the machinery to see how it might be made to do more. And his earliest real inventions, the ones that first lifted him out of poverty and gave him the money and the reputation to build his famous laboratory, were all inventions of the wire. He found a way, most cleverly, to make a single telegraph line carry not one message at a time, but several at once, in both directions, doubling and then quadrupling how much a wire could do, which was worth an enormous amount of money to the companies who had to string every one of those expensive wires across the country. He sold that cleverness for a sum that seemed to him a fortune, and with it he built the workshop where all the rest of the wonders would come from. Every light bulb that has ever burned, in a sense, was paid for by a boy's deep understanding of the clicking wire. The telegraph did not just employ Thomas Edison. It taught him how to think, and then it funded his dreams. The boy who saved a child on a platform and was taught the code in return would go on to give the world the electric light and recorded sound and moving pictures and 1,000 things besides. And it all began at a little brass key in the lamplit night, listening to the clicking. And here is the part that ought to make you smile as you drift off. He was not even the only one. In the very same years, in Pittsburgh, another poor boy, a small determined Scottish immigrant named Andrew Carnegie, took a job as a telegraph messenger, running wires through the streets for $2.50 a week. He was so eager that he taught himself to read the sounder by ear secretly before anyone had offered to promote him, and within a year they made him an operator, and not long after that a railroad took him on as its own personal telegrapher, and from that key at the heart of the railroad he began the long climb that would end with him one of the richest men who has ever lived, the king of American steel. The greatest inventor of the age and the richest industrialist of the age, and both of them as boys sat in the lamplight and learned to hear words in the clicking of a wire. The little brass key was for a poor and clever child one of the few doors in America that would actually open. Two of the people who walked through it walked a very long way indeed. But let us come back from those two grand lives to one more wonder of the wire itself, because it is the grandest of all, and because it is a good and soothing thing to think about as the night deepens. They ran a wire across the bottom of the ocean. For years the telegraph had knit the land together, but the great ocean still cut the world in two. A message from America to Europe still had to go the old way by ship, taking a week and more each way, so that the two halves of the Western world were still, in effect, weeks apart. And a man named Cyrus Field became obsessed, gloriously, impossibly obsessed, with the idea of closing that gap, of laying a single continuous wire, insulated and armored, from Ireland to Newfoundland, across 2,000 miles of open Atlantic, over the black and unmapped floor of the deep ocean 2 miles and more beneath the waves. It sounds like madness, and it half was. The first attempts failed, the cable snapping and vanishing into the depths, swallowing fortunes. But in the summer of 1858, they got a cable across whole, and for a few glorious weeks the two continents could speak. Queen Victoria sent a message of congratulation to the American president, a message of fewer than 100 words, and it took some 16 hours to make the crossing, each faint pulse coaxed through 2,000 miles of ocean-bottom wire. 16 hours. And people wept in the streets and rang the church bells and lit fireworks because 16 hours was not the point. The week was the point, the week that had just become 16 hours and would soon become a minute. The ocean, which had held the halves of the world apart since the beginning, had just been bridged by a thread. That first cable failed after only a few weeks, its faint signal fading and then falling silent, and it took years more and a great deal more heartbreak before the thing was finally truly done. And the way it was finally done is one of the great sights of the century, worth carrying with you into sleep. By the 1860s, there existed a ship unlike any that had ever floated, a vast iron leviathan called the Great Eastern, so enormous that she had been a commercial failure, too big for any ordinary purpose the world yet had. But she was, it turned out, exactly the right size for one impossible task. She alone could carry the entire coiled length of an ocean cable in her belly, thousands of miles of it, wound in her holds like some sleeping sea serpent. In 1865 they loaded her up and set out, paying the cable over her stern into the deep as she steamed slowly west, and 2/3 of the way across in mid-ocean the cable parted and slipped from their grasp and was gone, down 2 miles of black water to the ocean floor, and the great ship turned for home in defeat. But they came back. In the summer of 1866, the Great Eastern set out once more, and this time the cable held mile after mile, all the long, slow way across, until she steamed at last into a quiet bay in Newfoundland, trailing an unbroken thread of connection all the way back to Ireland, and it worked, and it held, and this time it did not fail. And then, in the weeks after, they did something that still sounds like a fairy tale. They steamed back out into the middle of the empty Atlantic to the spot where the lost cable of the year before had vanished, and they dragged the black floor of the deep ocean with grappling hooks 2 miles down in water no eye had ever seen, feeling blindly along the bottom of the world until, incredibly, they hooked the lost cable and lifted it, dripping up out of the abyss, and spliced it, and finished it too. So that a venture which had failed and broken hearts and swallowed fortunes ended with not one but 2 living wires joining the halves of the world. But from that year onward, the thing was done. The continents were wired together for good. A merchant in New York could learn the London prices the same morning. A family could hear of a death across the ocean while the grief was still fresh enough to share. The whole round world had been gathered up and connected at the speed of lightning by wires that ordinary operators sat and worked in lamplit rooms on both shores of every sea. It is one of the great quiet triumphs of human stubbornness, and it was built, in the end, out of the same dots and dashes you have been listening to all night. Every golden age ends, and usually it ends not with a crash, but with a slow quieting, and so it was with the world of the wire. The thing that ended it was, at first, another wonder, one we have already heard foretold in a love story. The telephone. In the 1870s, in the very years when the telegraph stood at its height, a new device appeared that could send not a code but the human voice itself directly along a wire so that two people could simply talk in their own voices with no operator between them and no code to learn at all. At first it was a toy, a curiosity, good only over short distances. The telegraph men, secure in their great humming network, were not much worried. Let the toy carry a neighbor's chatter across town. The serious business of the world, the news and the money and the train orders, would stay on the wire in the hands of skilled operators where it belonged. But the toy grew up. The telephone lines stretched further every year, and the voice, it turned out, was what people had wanted all along. Why learn a difficult code? Why pay an operator to translate your words into clicks and another to translate them back when you could simply pick up a receiver and speak and be heard in your own voice by the person you love? One by one, the things the telegraph had carried moved over to the telephone, and then, in time, to newer things still, to machines that typed the message out at the far end with no operator needed at all, and later to the fax and the computer and the small glowing rectangle in your own hand tonight, which is the telegraph's great-great-grandchild and does not know it. And so the operators, that whole skilled and proud community of the fist, slowly became unnecessary. It did not happen all at once. For decades yet, the wire still clicked in the railroad depots and the newspaper offices and the small towns. But the traffic thinned year by year. The offices closed one by one. The young people stopped coming in to learn the code because there was less and less need of it, and the operators at the keys grew grayer, and the great nervous system of the nation, nerve by nerve, went quiet. The most modern thing in the world became, within a single lifetime, a charming old thing, and then a forgotten thing, and the sound that had once tied a continent together grew rarer and rarer in the land until you had to go looking to hear it at all. And so we come gently to the end of our night beside the wire. We began by setting aside a gray little picture, the bored clerk at the boring machine, and I hope by now that picture is gone for good, replaced by something warmer and truer and far more alive. We stood at the moment the wire first spoke, and 4 astonished words crossed 40 miles in an instant, and the world in which far away meant long ago came quietly to an end. We looked at the little brass key and the clicking sounder and learned the deep, strange skill of hearing words in sound. We sat in the lamplit night office, alone but not lonely, in the good company of the wire. We held our breath with the depot operator keeping the trains apart in the dark, and we met the women for whom the key was the most independent thing in their lives, and we listened in with a whole delighted line on the lovers courting in code across the country. We followed the tramp operators drifting town to town and watched 2 poor clever boys at their little keys in the lamplight begin the climbs that would make one of them the greatest inventor and the other very nearly the richest man in the world. And we watched a single wire crawl across the floor of the ocean and gather the whole round earth into one connected place. And then slowly we heard it all grow quiet as a new age of voices came in and the clicking faded from the land. It lasted a little over a century, this world, from 4 words in 1844 to the slow silence of our own time. And in that century it did something that had never been done and can never be undone. It broke forever the ancient tie between distance and time. Before the wire, To be far away was to be in the past. After the wire, and ever since, and tonight, in the glowing rectangle you may be holding, the far side of the world is only a moment away. Every instant message you have ever sent, every piece of news that reached you the moment it happened, every voice that has crossed an ocean to reach your ear, is the direct descendant of a lamplit operator listening to a clicking sounder in the small hours of a vanished night. They built the nervous system we still live inside, and most of them are entirely forgotten. So rest now. Somewhere it is always the deep of the night in a small station on a quiet line, and one lamp is burning and one operator is keeping the watch, listening to the soft, companionable clicking of the wire as it carries the whispered talk of unseen friends across the whole breadth of a sleeping country. There is room for you there, in the warm and the lamplight, with nothing at all required of you but to listen and drift and let the clicking carry you down. From all of us here at Half Past History, thank you for spending this evening on the wire. Sleep well. And yet, if you are still here with me, still just this side of sleep, stay a moment longer. Because a story like this one leaves two small things behind, and I would like to give them to you before the lamp goes out. One is the day the clicking finally truly stopped, which was far more recently than you would ever guess. The other is the quiet secret that the code did not die even then. Neither will keep you awake. Both are best heard with your eyes already closed. The first thing I want to give you is a date, and it will surprise you because it is so recent. You would guess, wouldn't you, that the telegram died a long, long time ago. Back in the black and white world, sometime around the old films, the sort of thing your great-grandparents used. But it held on quietly at the edges of the modern world far longer than almost anyone realized. The great company that had carried so many of the nation's messages for so long, Western Union, the very name a byword for the telegram, kept the service running and running through the telephone and the television and the computer and the rise of the internet, sending fewer and fewer of them each year, mostly now for the solemn old occasions, a death, a formal congratulation, the moments when people still wanted the weight of a telegram rather than the lightness of a call. And then, at last, in the winter of the year 2006, Western Union sent its final telegram and quietly closed the service for good. 2006. Many of you listening tonight were fully grown adults in that year. The telegram, the thing we picture in sepia in the age of steam, outlived the 8-track tape in the video store and slipped away only a handful of years before the smartphone. It had run for 162 years, from Samuel Morse's 4 astonished words in 1844 to that last quiet message in 2006, and for most of that time it was the fastest way that ordinary human words could travel across the world. Think of that unbroken line as you lie there. All those operators, all those lamplit rooms, all those clicking sounders and graceful fists, a great chain of them reaching hand to hand down the years, from Morse's first message all the way to a final telegram sent in a world of mobile phones. And then the last operator somewhere tapped out the last message and lifted their hand from the key, and it was over, and the wire that had spoken for 162 years fell silent at last. But here is the second gift, the gentler one, and it is this. The code itself never really died at all. It is still out there tonight, tapping away in the dark, and it always will be. Because Morse code turned out to be far too useful and far too beautiful to disappear just because the telegraph companies closed. For a long time after the wires came down, ships at sea still spoke it, blinking it in light from bridge to bridge, tapping it out on their radios across the empty ocean, and the most famous message in the whole history of the code, that simple, urgent pattern of 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, the call for help we all somehow know, went on being sent by mariners in distress long after the last telegraph office had closed its door. Airmen used it to find their way by the beacons that tapped out their letters through the night. And spies and soldiers and explorers in far places carried it, because a signal so simple that it is only long sounds and short ones can get through where nothing else can, faint and far and buried in noise, when a voice would be lost entirely. And most touching of all, there are the people who simply love it. All over the world tonight, in spare rooms and attics and little sheds, amateur radio operators, tens of thousands of them, sit at keys not so very different from the ones we have talked about all night, and tap out Morse code to one another across the whole planet for no reason at all except the deep, quiet pleasure of it. They will tell you there is nothing else quite like it, to send your thoughts out into the dark as bare rhythm, and to feel a stranger's answer come tapping back out of the noise from the far side of the earth in that same patient language the night operators spoke 150 years ago. The fist lives on. Somewhere tonight, as you fall asleep, someone is listening to the clicking and hearing in it words. The instrument fell silent. The companies closed. The operators are nearly all gone now into history, unremembered. But the code they spoke is still out there in the air tonight, 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, patient and unkillable, a small human rhythm tapping quietly away in the dark, saying, across all the distance and all the years, I am here. Is anyone there? I am here. And now it is truly time to let the wire carry you the rest of the way down. Let the clicking soften. Let the lamp in the little station burn low. Let the operator lay down a gentle fist and the sounder fall quiet, and let the whole warm lamplit world of the wire fade softly into the dark, until it is only a slow and pleasant rhythm at the very edge of your sleep, and then not even that. You do not need to remember any of it. The dates will keep. The clever boys and the women at the keys and the lovers courting in code will keep. Somewhere it is always the deep of a quiet night on a sleeping line, and one lamp is burning, and the wire is murmuring its soft companionable clicking across the whole breadth of the land, asking nothing of you at all, except that you let go and drift and sleep. Thank you for spending this evening with me here at Half Past History. If you drifted off somewhere back among the clicking of the wire, then it worked, and I am glad, and I will be here again with another slow journey whenever you are ready for one. And if you are somehow still awake, then simply close your eyes now and let the quiet rhythm carry you the rest of the way down. Good night. Sleep well. The wire is quiet now, the lamp is low, and morning is a long and gentle way off yet.